Hassan Piker and then also Charlie Kirk, these people that have like millions of followers have, I would say, I don't know the exact influence in the UK, but in the United States, massive like you couldn't go online without seeing these people 12 times a day with clips other accounts are making and end over kind of thing. I think I saw Charlie Kirk is literally going to be like satirized in the next South Park episode.
I checked my emails maybe 12 hours, something like that, before the debate began, and I saw that kind of a few hours prior, so maybe a day before, they sent out this email to everyone saying, you've been selected to debate him, like, good job, you have to sign this waiver about, like, if you go viral and if everyone sends you death threats, it's not really the union's fault, it's your fault, you signed up for it. I'm someone who puts myself through the miserable job of engaging with his videos all the time because I watched I'm well versed in black pill content, in Nick Fuentes, in Andrew Tate, in the Manosphere. I'm someone who has unfortunately acquired a lot of knowledge about how the far right manifests itself online, and Charlie Kirk was of huge interest to me because to me, he was someone who toes that line between far right and actually totally mainstream, and he was an avenue through which some ideas that were initially fringe concepts ended up disseminating themselves across college campuses among young conservatives. For me, it was a no-brainer. I was obviously going to debate him if I could.
Like going back through and looking at some of your social media accounts to get like a little, I try to like prep myself a little bit in the mornings or whatever right before I do these things. It's like 8:30 in the morning here for me. I say that it's definitely not that way for you, so sorry, I forget about how time works. But yeah, I was like, holy shit, I did not even realize that. Like, I knew, the Charlie Kirk thing had gone viral. I had seen that, like I said earlier, played on everything from like Majority Report to I think like even here it was even on a little bit of like television here, like because Charlie Kirk is such a formative person, especially in the United States, unfortunately. And I was like, wow, that must have been a hell of a whirlwind when that all happened. So yeah, we're here recording now. I'm with Tilly Middlehurst, who some people may know from seeing, like we were just discussing, clips of you, at least from my perspective, trouncing a very big, right-wing influencer in Charlie Kirk and debating. I know you're at Cambridge University. You do sort of the academic debating there as well. That's where I first initially found some clips of things you had done. I went back and watched the YouTube video that your university, I believe, like put out of you kind of talking about the decline of America and your kind of point that it was a good thing for the world, which I both agreed with and thoroughly enjoyed. I know that's kind of simplifying your 11 to 15 minute statement on that. But again, happy to have you on here. What we're going to do today is kind of talk about where kind of all this came from for you. I always like to, when I first talk to people, especially when it comes to more political episodes I'm doing, kind of get your background a little bit. I always find it interesting, like where people's kind of political ideology comes from. Some people find it from punditry. You might find like an influencer that you first read onto. It might be lived experience. It might be your, what you're doing in school, everything in between. And then we're going to talk a little bit about, which I think like we probably primarily agree on the merits of debate and kind of talking to the other side of the aisle. But I have some questions for you there too, because I always have had mixed feelings on this since I was in college about the merits of debating and where that kind of comes from. So I can't think of anybody better to kind of break that down with, because it's been, especially since that Mehdi Hassan debate that went massive from Jubilee everywhere. I think it's been a conversation online that a lot of people that maybe don't really know what they're talking about from all sides of the conversation kind of dive into. So I kind of want to get all your thoughts on that. But to start off, I guess, like, you're at Cambridge. You've, like I said, there's been a few different moments where you've kind of given, I think, very great and detailed thoughts and provoking conversations on different topics. Where did it all kind of come from for you? Was that something that you kind of grew up with? Were there people in your life that kind of like influenced you to become politically active at a younger age?
Yeah, so I grew up I mean, wow. I mean, if I really have to go super far back, my parents, when I was about 3 or 4 years old, moved away from a town called St. Helens in England. And that town was, at the time, I'm not sure what the statistics look like now, but it was known as the suicide capital of England. So that was a town that was it was a post-industrial town. It had been decimated in the wake of a Thatcher government. And obviously the politics within that town reflected as such. So there was a huge kind of, there was a consortium of interest groups within that town. There was individuals who strongly believed in democratic socialist policies. There was a significant number of white supremacists within that town too. So it's a really interesting place for my parents to have grown up. And they had me when they were very young. They were 19 and 20 years old when they had me. And they disagreed with the way that politics was going within the town, and also obviously the quality of life there was not optimal at all. The coal mines had closed down. It was this post-industrial wasteland, and so they moved away. They moved to, I mean, a couple of hours away. I think something like a 45-minute drive, so it wasn't particularly far, but the quality of life was drastically different. Obviously, the way that that England is geographically speaking, you can drive for 10 minutes and you can end up somewhere where the life expectancy for you has drastically increased. So they moved away. And so their politics are heavily influenced by growing up in that town, which means that my politics are influenced by what it was like to watch them assimilate into a new town, and also kind of what it was like to grow up somewhere. I mean, it was still in the northwest of England, which is generally considered, especially in the south, as this post-industrial write-off anyway. But yeah, that was kind of my background and upbringing.
Yeah, and kind of going into that, I know that you know, I get you referenced something there. I think is very different in the sense of like from where I'm from in the United States. I live in a very, I'm not here to talk about me, but like, I grew up in a very conservative rural like area, still do now. There's not a wealth of difference in political views, right? Like I'm like a fish out of water everywhere I go when it comes to politics. When I discuss things with people, everyone's like a far right. There's Trump flags flying like right outside of my house, basically, like all over the place. And so that's an interesting kind of dichotomy or contradiction, I guess, there of people, which it does make sense of like democratic socialists and far right white supremacists, very similar to the MAGA movement in the United States. I guess like when it comes to you talk about that's your background, that your parents come from that. I guess like what are some things that you've kind of prioritized, or do you kind of view yourself as more focusing on like an economic left perspective? Do you kind of view things from like a social democratic perspective? Are you, like kind of like where did these things develop for you going into academia and kind of presenting publicly political views? Like what were some kind of things that were at the forefront for you politically?
I mean, I think, to be honest, the influence of that kind of standard post-industrial Marxism that I had growing up was really strong. And it was something that was kind of, I didn't really particularly question it until I ended up at university. And then I sat with supervisors who believed that class was actually cultural, and that middle class upbringing was essentially synonymous with the extent to which you kind of drink lattes in coffee shops. And there were all these like amorphous concepts that were introduced to me by supervisors at Cambridge who had this strong belief that class relations had completely eroded. So in terms of like the evolution of my political ideology, I think that sure, like the grounding is strong in that post-industrial Marxist ideas that come from the 90s as a reaction to kind of the winter of discontent, the strikes that occurred, and the terrible way in which Thatcher dealt with the unions. But I think that as my ideas have evolved, I have also collated other things alongside that. So one example of this is a lot of working class Brits find foreign policy essentially an abhorrent distraction from class relations that are happening on the ground at home. And as I entered Cambridge, I realized that obviously this is an incredibly reductive understanding. I can see why people would believe this, especially people who haven't experienced an elite education like I have. But one of the purposes of making the speech that I made about America a while back was to demonstrate why it is the case that American foreign policy has such an impact on the way that UK politics looks on the ground. And so that was something that was like central to the evolution of my political ideas. I do get a lot of comments kind of asserting that I'm asserting myself into foreign policy in which I do not necessarily belong, and that I should focus on domestic policy. And to me, I think that doesn't make much sense, given that the way that the economy works is through trade networks, it's through supply chains, it's through relationships that people establish with each other on a national scale and on an international scale, sorry. So I suppose that that's one of the main ways in which like I've grappled with the ideas that I have growing up, and how that can't necessarily always be reconciled with, like when I encounter an elite education when I enter these institutions.
it doesn't have to be like from an elite institution, right? I think there's a lot of disconnect where people, I find this a lot even with people that I agree with somewhat ideologically. I would kind of, I never know what to define things as, I guess, as a socialist or left wing progressive person in the United States. Is it's ironic that you talk about, that a lot of people view in the UK, foreign policy as sort of like this red herring, or like kind of separate from domestic policy, where like in the United States people feel that way, which I find extremely, extremely ironic, because like there's no place, I think, other than the place, the hundreds and hundreds of hundreds of countries that we kind of influence everything from their trade policy to their electoral politics, everything in between. But people do find this separation between like working class, even if it's progressive or sort of this like quote unquote right populist ideology. People like separate these things, and nothing's separated, nothing's in a vacuum. Like you could talk about any topic from anything from feminism to trade, like you said, trade policy to wage instability and everything else, and it's all connected to all these different topics. So when you've talked about those things, and as you said, people kind of tell you that you shouldn't be talking about trade policy in the context of kind of domestic politics, how big of like a, I guess, like a misnomer is that within the UK? I have a lot of American. I'm prefacing this with, I have a lot of American audience. Some of them come on here because I bring on bands and artists or whatever that they listen to. They're relatively apolitical sometimes when I speak to them. So I'm kind of coming from that background. Like, in what ways do you think people are misguided within the UK or the United States with that kind of separation? You get what I'm saying? Like that. Like in what ways, I guess, for you, that you, when you discuss these things with people, or have to kind of I guess like legitimize why you would talk on foreign policy when it pertains to the United States with UK politics, like where does can you kind of break that down a little bit? I mean, I'm not going to make you explain all of foreign policy in the context of domestic policy in the UK, but like how do things like that affect the everyday working class person in the UK from your perspective? And then we'll kind of get more into the debate kind of topics here.
Sure. I mean, I suppose there are two avenues we can take this down. The first one is a cultural perspective, as in the way in which the most powerful nation on earth, the United States, understands women, understands race relations, understands class, obviously is going to trickle down. I'm not a proponent of trickle-down economics, but I am a proponent of soft power, like cultural dynamics, wherein the United States is this epicenter of cultural, potentially even cultural violence that is then kind of diffused outwards into Europe and even across East Asia, And so I think that if we, insofar as we ignore issues that happen in the United States, we're also doing ourselves a disservice when it comes to deciding what we want to take into and imbue within our own culture in the United Kingdom and other countries across Europe. I also think that there's a pragmatic aspect here, which is that immigration policy is foreign policy. Immigration policy is not domestic affairs. It is the extent to which you intervene in other countries' foreign affairs and how and if that affects the influx of immigrants that come into your country. Foreign policy and domestic policy are entwined when it comes to immigration, which is such a hot topic in the United Kingdom at the moment. And you have this far-right party, Reform UK, which has come to the fore on a single issue, which is immigration. And previously, the leader of that party, Nigel Farage, was consistently peddling single-issue politics. And the one that worked, the one that landed, was immigration. And one of the reasons why I believe that this did land is because of the fact that politicians refuse to accept that immigration is a foreign policy problem. Instead of, and even Nigel Farage himself doesn't accept this. He believes that this is a domestic problem. And insofar as we simply expel immigrants outward, this is like the cure to English, like, social decline. Obviously, I think this is silly. And I think that one of the things that were pointed out, to Nigel Farage and to other members of Reform that kind of illustrated this point was that we can't simply expel immigrants outward without having any basic understanding of foreign relations. Unfortunately, if that's your belief system, unfortunately, that's the case, right? So, I mean, there was this conversation that was had, I think it was between a reporter and some prominent member of Reform UK, which was, how are you going to ensure that we don't break out into full-scale war with France when you send the boats back to the French coast? And the answer was, well, we can't really worry about that. All we can worry about is our own domestic affairs. And I think that that was an insane way to respond to the proposition that potentially we would be headed towards a full-scale war with our neighbor if we continue to expel refugees onto their coast.
Yeah, it's kind of insane. Like it's interesting how much things, how different things can be, and yet how much things can be the same. Because whenever I talk about foreign policy whether it's, doing this or, some outlets I'll work for, or just people within my community. The idea, it's different here, obviously, because again, I'm in the imperial core here of the United States, but like, people talk about Venezuelan immigrants, or they would talk about migrants, and that's like the topic now, especially as they get rounded up and things of that nature in this country. And yet literally no one, including the Democratic Party, let alone the Republicans here, somewhere to reform now, really, not even really the Tories at this point, is that like no one wants to talk about like destabilization in other countries that are south of us, and why that sends more people, and how like any creation of inequality and like American, hegemony like across the world, like creates more people moving here, right? Like not to say that I'm, I welcome all people into this country. I think it's actually a good thing for immigrants. So it's a different topic. We're not going to solve that here on a singular podcast. But I do think that's interesting how much people, both politicians, pundits, whatever, on a lot of sides of the aisle, will try to separate these issues. When again, everything's so connected in the UK, let alone the United States. So thanks for breaking that down. That's really cool kind of background, and great to hear like you kind of encompass these issues together, which I think is like the most effective way to talk about these things to people. I kind of want to dive in a little bit. I know you're very well versed politically. Obviously, you study at a very prestigious university. But what I want to know a little bit about is you're diving into debate, because I know you do this at Cambridge. I've seen things from your university with you and others doing things with Hassan Piker. You did things with, obviously the most viral thing, Charlie Kirk. And again, like my favorite clip, honestly, is that one that you broke down what we were just talking about a little bit with foreign policy, and at the end of Unipolar.
Milton Friedman expresses the US foreign policy approach nicely when he contends that profit-making is democracy, that any government pursuing anti-market policies is therefore anti-democratic, that it's the job of the United States to overthrow democratically elected governments in the interests of stability. It's why the Allende government in Chile, which enjoyed significant popular support, was overthrown with vigor. It's why Colombia's domestic wheat industry was decimated, leading to nationwide drug problems. It's why Bolivian water was privatized, a coup incited by the CIA in Guatemala. It's why the Venezuelan government and oil firms were blocked from accessing international credit markets. It's why authoritarian regimes in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Egypt are supported for their role in maintaining stability. It's why the US protected time. It's why the US has a uniquely terrifying relationship with Israel, whereby the ethno-state can commit atrocities with unconditional support, because a stable Israel is a buffer of Western influence in the Middle East, a buffer that secures oil flows essential for the American economic interest, because America never bows, it never bends, it never breaks, it owns the finish line. Don't fear multipolarity, fear the only state that can't be contained. And
polarity and all those different things. Where did your interest come from with debating issues or debating opposing narratives, whether you're someone like me in my 30s or you in university? Like more and more people now enjoy. I mean, I think people enjoy debate as spectacle on streams a lot. Like, that's the things that blow up online over and over again, whether it's Jubilee or a streamer or whatever on Twitch. But I don't know how many people like in their day-to-day lives really enjoy debating anymore. Like I do think a lot of people like to go into their echo chambers and kind of go into the bubbles, find their specific media outlets that kind of define their personality and identity in politics. When did that kind of become formative for you, when it came to political discussion, that debate was something that you wanted to dive into?
Sure. So when I was about 17 years old, I started to engage within the competitive formalized debating sphere. And we call that in the UK and kind of globally the debate circuit. And on the debating circuit, we abide by a whole bunch of rules, and there are these formalized structures, and we have competitions and all this kind of thing. And I kind of was super interested in this, but I wasn't necessarily meant to be, given my upbringing. So what I mean by that is I went to a school in the UK, which was a good school. It was a grammar school, which means that you have to take a test to get into the school, but it was also free to attend. It was a state school. Now, in the UK, 7% of people attend private schools. And what that looks like is an elite network of individuals who have access to resources beyond the average human being's comprehension when it comes to education. And one of the things that private school people tend to engage in a lot is competitive debating, which is a formalized challenge to a set of predisposed ideas. And specifically, this concept in competitive debating is British parliamentary debate. And this is where you're given 15 minutes to write a 7-minute speech. You're assigned a random side for that. So you're either proposition or opposition. And then it's your job to speak in favor of or in opposition to that given motion within these strict time limits. You're not allowed to use the internet. You're heavily reliant on your general knowledge and your understanding of logic. To me, was something that was such a foreign concept because of the fact that I was brought up within the state school system. So when I stumbled upon debate, really. I had a friend who was looking at what kind of things you're meant to do to get into a good university. And she'd Googled it and debate came up. So I self-taught myself for a few months with the competitive debating style, and then entered a competition with her. Following that competition, we made it to the finals, which meant that we had to travel in person to Cambridge. Actually, it was a Cambridge competition. So we had to travel in person to Cambridge to compete. And that was when I thought, I'm a bit screwed if I don't have a debate coach here, because these private school kids spend hours and hours every day doing this competitive debate stuff. And I still hadn't the faintest clue. I was speaking kind of freely about what my thoughts were on a topic, and had accidentally made it to the finals round of a debating competition by doing that. And I knew that on the finals day, I couldn't pull that off a second time. So I Googled a bunch of private schools on the internet, so that they're super famous. You might have even heard of them. Eton College, Westminster. I Googled these kind of famous names, and then I attached a debate coach at the end. And I stumbled upon a debate coach who used to teach Etonians. And I messaged him on Twitter and I said, look, I don't have the money to coach with you, but will you coach me anyway? And I sent him a few videos of the speeches that I'd made based on self-teaching, and he agreed to coach me. So that was how I got into the competitive debating stuff. And through that, it totally changed my life. I was introduced to networks of individuals who previously I was completely shut out from. I managed to impress based on merit alone, not based on my background. And that was something that I thought would be impossible for me. There were a few kind of fallbacks. For example, I was told to modulate my accent heavily so that I could be understood by judges who had also gone to private school, so that I can gain more speaker points. So I ended up having this, what my family called a debate voice, which was a fake posh English accent that I would put on so that I could debate convincingly enough that my rhetoric would be understood and that my logic could be viewed first rather than my accent, rather than my background. So that was how I got into competitive debate. And since then, I have basically made it my mission to promote debating as an avenue through which you too can gain the critical insight into like issues of our time, in the same way that these elite institutions are teaching you to do it, in the same way that they're kind of gatekeeping from you. That's not inevitable. It's not inevitable that you'll be unable to learn these frameworks and unable to critically engage with what's going on in the world.
Yeah, wow. That's a pretty fascinating story to kind of like go through all of that and kind of, you know, basically kind of like you said, like stumble into this whole thing that you didn't have the same background as a lot of your private school peers, and end up becoming a hell of a debater, right? And be able to again like get to where we are now, where you have debated, you know, I would say, either with in your kind of the Cambridge debate, would it be? I'm probably using the ideology wrong. Debate team, debate organization. I don't know, but you know, with Hassan Piker and then also Charlie Kirk, these people that have like millions of followers have, I would say, you know, I don't know the exact influence in the UK, but in the United States, you know, massive like you couldn't go online without seeing these people 12 times a day with clips other accounts are making and end over kind of thing. I think I saw Charlie Kirk is literally going to be like satirized in the next South Park episode, you know,
Yeah.
and things of that nature. Like that's like a big turnaround and a really cool thing. So before we kind of get into the ethics and utility of debate that I wanted to discuss with you, because I couldn't think of like a better person to kind of talk about this topic with, when you first, you know, have these, you know, like I said, you had these clips where I first found you online, you know, debating foreign policy or debating, you know, intersected politics and everything in between. You know, you debate a little bit with Hassan on his stream. You debate Charlie Kirk. You know, I guess getting to the Charlie Kirk one where things really kind of like went insane. Did you kind of realize in that moment, or kind of like walk me through, I guess, this kind of trajectory where this happens for you? How did you kind of get with the Charlie Kirk one specifically? How did you get connected with that? How much time did you have to prep? And then what was your initial reaction? What did you think was going to come out of that? And we can kind of just break down, I guess, the insanity of all that to begin with, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I've always been unofficially a part of the Cambridge Union, so I'm not really a person who's particularly interested in formalized student politics, like student union stuff. I get involved in societies insofar as it counts for the networking, but I don't necessarily take up formalized positions unless it's something that has a lot of utility. And I also find that student campaigns and student elections, it's not somewhere that I feel I'm particularly productive. So I was involved in the Cambridge Union stuff very informally. I always found myself like gaining positions as a speaker in debates without ever having to be on a committee or that type of thing, because I kind of had friends from the union. And it's student politics. It's as corrupt as real politics. So that's how I'm connected to the Cambridge Union at all, which is very like narrowly. I'm not like president of Cambridge Union Debate Club, which is kind of a lot of the narrative that a lot of people run with is like she's this huge debate nerd who's like president of her debate club and her association, all that stuff. So I just followed the Cambridge Union on Instagram, and they made a post that Charlie Kirk was coming into debate. So there was this form that I had to fill in, which basically was, what's your name and what question might you want to ask? So I just wrote down the question that I asked him, which was about the role of women in public and private life. What should that look like to him? What are the benefits of doing that? A question that I still haven't received the answer to, unfortunately. Yeah, so that was the process. I mean, I'm not someone who regularly checks my emails, so I checked my emails maybe 12 hours, something like that, before the debate began, and I saw that kind of a few hours prior, so maybe a day before, they sent out this email to everyone saying, you've been selected to debate him, like, good job, you have to sign this waiver about, you know, like, if you go viral and if everyone sends you death threats, it's not really the union's fault, it's your fault, you signed up for it. So, yeah, we signed this waiver in the debate chamber. I actually had this law student next to me, and I asked him to explain like the extent to which I was signing away my soul, but it wasn't that much. It was fine, so I signed it. Yeah, so that was kind of the process. It was very quick, and it wasn't something that I thought through the optics of, etc. All I knew was that I'm someone who is like heavily into researching the right wing, especially the right online, and how that plays out in politics today, because I think that this is a huge blind spot for people in academia. So that's what my undergrad dissertation is to do with. It's to do with the rise of the far right online and how the aesthetics of the far right and how the language that the far right deploys is used in mainstream politics over time. So my debate with Charlie Kirk was a means by which to essentially just disseminate the message that I don't think all college kids are as unprepared as he initially would imagine. I think I was a great person to do it because I'm someone who puts myself through the miserable job of engaging with his videos all the time, because I watched I'm well versed in black pill content, in Nick Fuentes, in Andrew Tate, in the manosphere. I'm someone who has unfortunately acquired a lot of knowledge about how the far right manifests itself online, and Charlie Kirk was of huge interest to me because to me he was someone who toes that line between far right and actually totally mainstream, and he was an avenue through which some ideas that were initially fringe concepts ended up disseminating themselves across college campuses among young conservatives. So for me it was a no-brainer. I was obviously going to debate him if I could.
Do you agree that it's a good thing that more women get married and have children in the West?
I would ask you, would you say that a sub-Saharan African woman who's experienced female genital mutilation and checks extremely happy in a survey, and I also would check extremely happy in a survey, who do you think would be objectively more happy, even if they both check the same answer?
No, okay, so I fully, if you want to talk about how Islam mistreats women, we could talk all day long. Like, I'm all for that.
Me too.
Okay, good, so we agree.
Absolutely,
we actually
agree on many things.
That we should shut off Muslim immigration to the UK, right? We totally agree.
I think that all religious fundamentalism is bad, and if you take that logic, we should also not allow evangelical Christians.
Well, okay, hold on a second. Hold on. That's funny. Hold on.
Yeah, and kind of break that, it's interesting that that's what your dissertation's on, because I think that is something that, I think a lot of like mainstream media, at least, again, I can only speak for the States here, they do talk about like far right radicalization online. It's kind of this buzz phrase they'll use, but without ever actually trying to understand and comprehend like where that comes from. They constantly hear, especially after the last election, talk about trying to find like a left-wing Joe Rogan, like that's going to be like the end-all be-all of how like we bring young men back over to the Liberal Party or things of that nature. Like, but before we kind of get into some of these other things, like, what are some things, I'm not going to make you try to break down your dissertation you're doing at school, but I mean, what are some things that you think, after debating Charlie Kirk, obviously you consume all these different kinds of content creators. I try to do the same thing just because I don't want to be in a bubble. I think that is a very dangerous thing for people that are progressive to do, and I think it's something a lot of people like to do just for their own blood pressure maybe or something, I don't know. But what are some things that you kind of view, as, whether it was like when you're going to this debate specifically Charlie Kirk or in general with the far right, as you've as you said you've been very well versed in this, what are some things that you see from this kind of like online growth of the far right? For a long time, I think conservatism, at least in the United States, I would probably say the same for the UK, was kind of viewed as like the wealthy older man's like viewpoint. The Republican Party wasn't cool here. The Tories weren't like the cool party, or the Reform Party wasn't like the cool edgy party. And then that really shifted, I think, around 2015, 2016, kind of flipped everything on its head as far as the, dynamics of discourse and the Overton window and everything. Like, what do you see they're kind of like some of these triumphs that they have of how they connect with younger people now, or just like public at large in such a profound way? Because, I think a lot of people really like do not, it's a tough thing to comprehend from like, even from liberal or progressive or whatever spaces you're at, of like how this has become so prolific. You know what I'm saying?
I do. I 100% understand you. And I think that it was so intelligent, the way in which the right co-opted the spaces that the left initially dominated, i.e., we are the subversive party. We are a party that doesn't operate within the mainstream because we're anti-establishment, and we don't, like, we're this party that is against all these social norms that liberal elites have established in society. I think that was so interesting and just expertly done. And I can do nothing. I mean, if someone asked me to say, what's one thing about the right that you have admiration for, it would be that. It would be the way in which they have successfully managed to dominate like every random industry on planet Earth. Like, now your favorite gym influencer is a Trump supporter, chances are. Now, every single woman who I follow online for like recipes, who does lifestyle content, who engages in any kind of feminine interest, chances are they're more likely to be on the right. And to me, that's something that's so interesting because, but it also makes sense. I mean, insofar as there was this very small, maybe half a decade, where liberalism actually made progress, or progressive ideas gained some mainstream appeal. And what that meant was the right had a chance to say, this thing is now mainstream, which makes us now anti-establishment, even though this wasn't something that had got particularly far. Like maybe some workplaces were asking you for your pronouns. This wasn't something that was a restructuring of an economic model. We weren't capitulating into communism, and it wasn't as alarmist as the right was making out. But insofar as like the left has always been a group who transgress social norms and are unapologetic for doing so. And what that meant was, according to the right, this generated this feeling of disgust in them. As in, okay, well, I'm seeing a woman and she has short hair and she's not wearing makeup and she doesn't care about her weight. This is someone who I'm not going to associate with. I'm not attracted to. And insofar as the right don't feel attracted to something, this automatically tends to map onto some kind of moralistic viewpoint, which is why I think people say we need a left-wing Joe Rogan. We need a left-wing, people reference Hassan Piker as someone who has done this really well, which is like, I'm just a normal guy who likes to work out and I believe in left-wing politics, and I think that's one of the reasons why people potentially were a little bit surprised by the things that I had to say about progressive politics, because of the fact that I'm typically quite a feminine woman with blonde hair, and I've had a few comments about my Republican makeup and my Republican fashion sense. So, but in a way, I can understand from an optics perspective why that's something that the left feel fascinated by and why they feel the need to co-opt for themselves.
Yeah. I think I think the point that you make too, where like literally every, thanks for breaking that down, that literally everything, every sort of like quote unquote apolitical aspect of online, communities or discords or whatever the case may be, like the second it veers into anything sort of political or just, cultural, it's very clear that a lot of these things are, what I would call like fascist coded almost in some indications. Like there was, I just saw the other day of one of the biggest, like, like you were talking about, like weightlifting and fitness streamers was talking about in like defending, Hulk Hogan using the N-word about people and like the whole 9 yards, like, what I'm saying? Like it's everywhere. And I think that's something that like, liberal institutions, like, people would view as liberal elite institutions, whether it's political organizations or universities or whatever else, they kind of miss the mark on that and view it as sort of like something in a vacuum, or that just, people start off wanting to engross themselves in right-wing ideology, where it's like, that's actually not the case. It's very much that is the byproduct, and then they follow a pipeline, right? Like, which again is an overused term, but I think that's very accurate in what entails a lot of people that I've even known in my life transition from sort of a normie type person in politics in their 30s or 40s even. It's not just someone young. I think that's sort of a misnomer too, into these very far right politics where, the next thing they're celebrating and like acting like it's a team sport when people are getting abducted like by ICE agents, in the case of the United States, and like acting like it's some sort of like own the libs type situation, and not really realizing the reality of like, this is affecting human beings' lives that are, just the same as you in a lot of ways. So yeah, thanks for bringing that down a little bit. We're kind of getting to here, we talked about the Charlie Kirk debate, I guess, and we talk about these other things, again, like the precursor of this conversation kind of blew up online a little bit after the Mehdi Hassan Jubilee surrounded debate. Again, this debate about debate comes up all the time, right? Like that, whether or not, and I think of it more, I guess, like here's my kind of blasé opinion on it, is that like I do really, really appreciate your insight on this, that talk about that you need to not go in bubbles, but to engage these topics, because these people have such big platforms, because it's proliferated so much in our society, again, especially online, but also in real life, day-to-day activities, that you have to engage these topics, that you have to engage people that you might even find insufferable and their viewpoints disgusting or dehumanizing or whatever the case may be, because it's there. Right. And I think people like yourself, that is the case. You are able to present these ideas well. You stick to the topic. I especially appreciate on the Charlie Kirk one. I'll probably throw in some clips on the edited version for people to check out if they haven't seen it already. But what I liked is you tried to keep him on topic, because another thing that they like to do oftentimes in these streamer debates, or less like academic or prepared people, in the context of yourself to the layman on a stream, ad hominem, and just kind of, he's very good at having the conversation go quick, switching it to a different topic, and then you're not talking about anything that you want to talk about at all, or what the pertinent, discourse is. I guess like my view on it, though, is like I am very cynical or critical or skeptical of politics as spectacle, right? Like, or politics as content alone. And I think what a lot of people do now is, whether it's be like Hassan, I think he did one with his former podcast host, or you'll see different people like Destiny, or all these different people kind of like Twitch debate kind of avenues. Like it feels like a lot of times to me, it's spectacle. People just, it's kind of like slop for views. I think people could say that for Jubilee type stuff as well a lot of the time. And that it can also, in certain instances, actually platform fascist or far right ideologies further, right? So I guess I'm a centrist on this issue, if you will. So I guess, like, what is the purpose when you're debating ideologically opposed public figures? Is it de-radicalization, platforming of progressive views, confronting regression? Like, what do you kind of view the purpose and the utility of in sort of debate spaces?
I mean, it's a great question. I understand why the debate is being had about the utility of debate. And potentially I can make a politician style answer, and I can tell you that the irony of the fact that we're debating the utility of debate means that we can't let this type of skill set be co-opted by one group of individuals with nefarious interests. But if I were to actually engage with you and speak to you from my perspective about why I debate, I would say that there are a whole bunch of reasons. There are a host of reasons. The first one is because I want to optically look good. Like, the left has an optics issue. I think we have not been able to successfully capture aesthetics, and that is not solely our fault. We've discussed just earlier that the nature of the left is that it doesn't apologize for the transgression of social norms. But I also believe, two things can exist at once. We are also in a state of political emergency, and in that emergency, our behavior must look different. Ben Shapiro was quoted, this was probably a quote from a while ago, but it stuck in my head. He was saying that he was asked what the purpose of debate for him was, and he said the purpose of debate, specifically debating college kids, is humiliation. I believe that we absolutely must fight that. And I also, secondly, my answer to why I debate is because I want to uphold universities and intellectualism as sites of positive change. I think that we need to bring back intellectualism to the fore, and you're absolutely right that there has been a worrying hybridization of entertainment with politics. I think insofar as I can entertain people and at the same time bring prominent issues to the forefront, that's something that is a win for me. And I think the reason why we have been unsuccessfully able to do that is because the truth is often messy, complicated, and boring. And that's why we need compelling figures. And, this isn't me stroking my own ego. I'm kind of pitching this to others. We need compelling figures out there who are disseminating the truth in a way that is entertaining, that isn't something that is simply boring and imbued with statistics. Some of the things that the left does incorrectly is it never explains the why. The left will explain what the status quo looks like and why this is a bad thing, but not necessarily why their solutions are the best solutions, or why it is the case that, moralistically speaking, they have the higher ground here. And I just think that, sure, there are obviously lines that we shouldn't cross when it comes to debating. There are obviously ways in which that debating badly can have a negative outcome. But overall, if we if we on the left continue to hide away from these conversations, and if we continue to hide away from the fact that this is how politics looks now, then we just bury our heads in the sand further.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's all accurate, and I agree with you in a lot of different ways. I think, like, for me, this topic kind of comes up a lot, and again, I forget, it might have been Chris Hedges or some political academic that I have a lot of respect for, that it kind of continues to harp away at this, politics as spectacle, or politics as you said, like entertainment, that I think, like, what you've done in these videos, or some other, like, again, Mehdi Hasan is someone that I look at a lot, that I don't view his debates as like slop, right? I guess, like, my issue with, like, the sort of debate culture within political spaces that has gotten so big, and there are, like, left-wing or at least liberal people that kind of engage in these spaces, and whether it's stream culture or online videos, or virality things similar to what you did, but just kind of like perpetually do these things over and over again, is that, like, I feel like it can kind of, in some ways, like, dumb down the discourse for what people will consume, right? Like, again, I don't think that any of us, like you and I, like, makes sense. I guess it makes sense to me that someone like yourself, first of all, doing a debate like with Charlie Kirk as an example, I would view it as good that someone like yourself does that, and then ends up getting an online profile, because I think there needs to be more people in progressive spaces that are able to do what you do, right? And building up, I think, on its own, debating a larger right-wing figure to build up a public profile is in and of itself, I think, a good thing to do. What I think I kind of question more is when there's these already large public platform progressives or liberal commentators, or whatever the case may be, continuing to debate with other far right people on their platforms, to where, like, I forget what somebody said about the Mehdi Hasan debate that just came out the other day. It was something effective, like, he may bring over 100 people, 100 young people that watch so many young people watch the Jubilee videos. He might bring over 100 people to the progressive side, but in doing so, 10,000 fascist people had their views platformed and normalized. So I guess, like, what are your thoughts on those kind of things? Because obviously, like, the idea of debate and engaging people to make your ideas interesting, entertaining, everything in between is all merited. I just kind of, there's certain avenues of it that I guess I question what the good is that comes out of it. Including, Mehdi himself said a similar thing after it. He was like, I don't know if this was a good thing or a bad thing. I'm very conflicted, as an example. I guess, what are your thoughts on those types of things?
I mean, I think I would avoid debating Joe from across the street, especially if Joe from across the street doesn't believe in interracial marriage. I have some common sense ideas about what kind of politics we should involve within the debating sphere, and generally speaking, within mainstream political culture at large. I also think that there's a certain idea when it comes to debate. There's an idea that I believe has been disseminated that is the wrong definition of debate. I don't think that debate means having a conversation then reaching a middle ground. I think that lends itself to legitimating views that are bad and dangerous and objectively corrosive for our social health. I believe that debate is a formalized challenge in a public setting to a set of ideas that ideally have become mainstream, at least to some extent. That's why I think that Mehdi Hasan debating the fascists, the guy who proclaimed himself to be a fascist, the fact that he got the opportunity to crowdfund off of that obviously leaves a bad taste in your mouth. And obviously it means it speaks to a larger idea, which is that now people are allowed to say that they're fascists on the internet. People are allowed to say that. Sure, he got fired from his job, but he also had people donate lots of money to him, and now he is probably going to enter some kind of public-facing role. At the same time, I think legitimation, the idea that we legitimate views by engaging with them, prescribes that the idea ought to be taken seriously or incorporated into policy. Whereas having a debate it documents the existence of a viewpoint. It does not prescribe that we should accept it as valid or worthy. And I think if an idea already operates within the mainstream consensus, then you basically have one of three choices, right? The first choice that you have is that you hope this thing goes away and you ignore it. But to me, this doesn't make sense anymore. I think the reason why it doesn't make sense is because the left are on the back foot. So, for example, in polling, young men now are more against women's rights than old men. There was a recent snap election in South Korea where 74% of young men voted for far-right and right-wing parties compared to something like 60% of very old men. This is hugely significant. Obviously, in the UK, reform is on the rise. We just won a landslide. Reform just won a landslide in local elections. I think that to say a group of people whose ideas are increasingly being relegated to the minority, i.e. the left, to say that we as a group should be ignoring a culturally more significant movement than us, speak to our own arrogance, right? So obviously we can't just ignore it and hope it goes away. The second thing is we can debate them badly. And I think this is something that we've seen a lot, which is you basically throwing a bunch of random idiots at the right-wing machine as cannon fodder. You cannot throw someone who's inexperienced into a debate with a man who has a media team. You can't do it. Like, I think encouraging random college students to debate ideologues like Charlie Kirk, like Ben Shapiro, without adequate preparation, training, media training included, is something that is naive as well. But the third option is obviously you can debate them well. And I think that's where we're at. We're at having that conversation now among the left of we can no longer ignore this. We can no longer debate them badly. Now we have to do it well.
Yeah, I mean, this shows how good you are at kind of delivering views, because I have nothing I have nothing against that. Yeah, I think that all makes a lot of sense. I guess for yourself personally, are there lines for who you view other progressive academics or, somebody, as you just said, who's well-versed and prepared? Are there lines or certain people that, we should not debate? Because again, I talked again about Mehdi Hasan, and I had posted a clip of what he had kind of done in response of a town hall the other day that he talked about. And in the video that we're, listening to, that he wouldn't debate a fascist. And the reason why he wouldn't is because the person, they're not, I guess like in that video, it was striking to me how little the people actually would engage in the question at hand, which I think is another thing right-wing people can do extremely well, even if they're not well-versed. Like you said, that kind of does put left-wing people on the back foot, because they're able to just pull the goalpost somewhere else, and then that's where the conversation goes. Or, in the case of a fascist, or I would say someone like you brought up, Nick Fuentes earlier, like that's someone that I would struggle with the utility of discussing these things with someone like that. That's like an out and out, just like Catholic nationalist fascist openly, right? Like, are there lines or are there people you would not personally debate if it came to that?
Yeah, so I tend to abide by what the Cambridge Union dictates as appropriate. And the reason for that is I just think it is common sense. So in the Cambridge Union, when people are discussing, well, what kind of speaker should we have platformed at the Cambridge Union? This is a prestigious institution. We have a YouTube channel with quite a lot of subscribers. We have some influence over academia in the UK, and we have a significant endowment. So with all those things in mind, how are we going to appropriately engage in debates whilst also maintaining that aspect of freedom of speech? And what the Cambridge Union essentially says is we're probably not going to have some random guy who calls himself a race realist with 10 followers on Twitter come and make a speech in a suit at a prestigious chamber like the Union's debating chamber. But if that guy has 100,000 followers online, then that is a different conversation, because that means now there is a specific context in which it is appropriate to challenge those beliefs. I don't think that I think it's very important that we do establish the right context, and universities are good contexts to be doing that. Do I think that it's okay for Jubilee to have brought in a guy who calls himself a fascist? I'm potentially even conflicted on that too, because when Mehdi Hasan says he doesn't debate fascists, what he means is I don't debate people who say I'm a fascist out loud. He does debate fascists all the time. I'm sure people debate closet fascists every day. I believe strongly that Charlie Kirk is a fascist. Charlie Kirk would never call himself as such. Even Nick Fuentes, I'd probably have to press him a little bit before he calls himself a fascist with genuine intention of portraying that he does abide by the definitional understanding that we have of fascism. So those are my thoughts. I mean, like Mehdi himself, I'm a little conflicted about the utility of doing even that. But when it comes to who I'm going to debate, I would rather not spend my days on online debating with random people who have no influence over society. I believe that the left, should probably have some grace and decorum in the way that it engages with ideas online. I don't think debate should be this thing where you consistently provide a platform to people whose ideas are just incredibly fringe and odd, and then they're allowed to kind of speak into the void these ridiculous presuppositions about how the world should work. Of course I don't believe that. I always try to organize debates with people who I believe have more influence than me, or whose ideas have allowed something terrible to happen. So for example, I'm trying to organize a debate at the moment with Pearl Davis. She's a far right lady.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't throw out personal attacks. She's a far-right lady who believes that women shouldn't be allowed to vote and that men are naturally inclined towards cheating, all kinds of strange red pill things. And I think even though her influence has declined, her ideas have actually not. And I think that Pearl is someone who's excellent to debate when it comes to optics because she's not very good at debating. And the reason she gained popularity was because of the fact that she was a woman saying things that red pill men have been saying for years. And because of the fact that she was friends with people like Andrew Wilson and his wife, I believe that she was someone who was quite central. She was like this unwitting participant who was at the epicenter of red pill ideology, and she allowed those ideas to diffuse into mainstream culture. And so insofar as I challenge someone who is just objectively not a very good debater, but whose ideas have had such influence, that I think that would be a net positive insofar as I prepare well for it.
Yeah, no, I think that is a good point, and I do like, I absolutely agree. Like, I think like you posted something online about, you know, debating Pearl Davis, and my initial reaction was like, I kind of forgot she existed, but then I looked up online, and I was just like,
She's
it's
still
like
going.
another thing of me being in my little bubble, right? Like, or just not seeing that content, you know, proliferate to you know, my neck of the woods, basically. But like, that's kind of what I got when I thought about that specifically, because yeah, she is so odd, right? Like, I remember seeing her on, I think it was Pierce Morgan's show or somebody's show where
It would have been Piers Morgan.
Yeah, brought her on, and it was like laughably bad and just weird, and just like this kind of odd laugh that she would do and kind of look around for everybody to think she was so edgy and all these different things. But yeah, I mean, those ideas are massive, and she did normalize a big space of that. And like you said, was kind of like able to do so because in essence she was saying, as a woman, things that like right wing weirdos had been saying for years, and kind of validating it in that way. And I think like that, I guess that, yeah, I think you kind of said the same line that I would have, is like, for someone like yourself, again, people will talk about that debating on, you know, these public figures is kind of like to build somebody's public profile and kind of say that as a pejorative. But I don't think it is a pejorative. Like, I think someone like you said, debating anyone that has a bigger online platform than yourself, to both ridicule them and have other people, then, you know, then your profile gets boosted, more people see progressive views, more people kind of see how you interact with these people that they can engage in, maybe even in their day-to-day lives too. I think that's like an important thing of seeing someone that's an accomplished debater, is kind of knowing how to address topics like in an effective way. And that was kind of like something that like changed my perspective a little bit when I thought about that, was like, you know, in and of itself, building a public profile at this point especially is virtuous in helping promote, you know, more progressive ideas, which I think some people kind of dismiss as like self-aggrandizing or something, you know.
Yeah, I've received various comments that I'm simply trying to establish myself as a brand and I don't care about the issues, or that I believe debating is the only way that we can do politics. So something that particularly exasperates me is when I will get online and I will say, debating is a significant strength of mine. It's something I've been formally trained in since I was 17 years old. I believe that debating is one of many important ways that we can engage in politics beyond the ballot box. And this is how I'm going to do that. And my comments are, so we should just debate the Nazis. So we should have just debated the Do I honestly believe that the only way to do politics is to debate someone? If someone had a gun to my head, am I going to debate them out of shooting me? Obviously not. Like, there is some nuance to be had here, but also debating can be effective even against people who have such extreme views. Like, there are examples where we have debated on basic rights. For example, we had the Cambridge Union debate, I think 1965, was called the Baldwin-Buckley debate, and it was about basically whether or not black people should be allowed in public. Like, it was a ridiculous debate, but it was also it's the most famous debate that the Cambridge Union ever hosted, because it was so significant when it came to bringing forth issues of civil rights in the UK. And there are other there are other ways in which we can engage in politics that are beyond voting and beyond violence. And I don't think that that's something that the left should shy away from. I think that, there's this famous tweet that went viral about potentially an issue that the left has, which was, what was it now? It was something to do with, I'm paraphrasing heavily, but it was basically something like a left-wing person will get online and say, your political strategy is completely inferior to my strategy, firebombing a Walmart, and then not firebomb a Walmart. And I think, that's where we're at.
Yeah. I mean, I think all that's accurate, and I also think like that's why I like to, online discourse. So much of it is so like it's literally microblogging in the case of Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever, or short clips on various social media platforms. And none of it's like nuance and long form. That's why I enjoy doing this more than doing a lot of other things, because you can actually kind of break down these ideas in a way that isn't some soundbitey nonsense that like totally I think people's level of nuance has just been obliterated over the last several years anyway. But it gets so lost in like these conversations people have online. And so yeah, I agree with all of that. That makes a lot of sense. I guess like another, I won't hold you here too much longer. I really appreciate your time going over all this. A lot of this has been very, very interesting for me. I guess like, we talk about that debate is a good, is a vessel that people, that are well versed and, know what they're doing and don't, like you said, aren't like a 19-year-old walking up to Ben Shapiro and being humiliated in front of millions of people. As an academic and intellectual debater, are there tips, strategies? I know you coach people, so I'm not trying to have you give the whole pitch away. People should definitely go, and I'll put the link below as well for people to learn how to debate from Tilly, who's absolutely fantastic at this sort of thing. I need to get much better at this myself. Are there tips or strategies you think people can use, for debate in general that you think are more effective than kind of what we're just describing as like the worst possible outcome of people being humiliated by these right wingers? I think like these tips, while we're talking about people with public platforms and stuff, debate in general is a thing I think people should can utilize in their own life when these conversations arise, and oftentimes end up being put into the similar traps that we can see from public figures, right? So I guess like, do you have tips or strategies or any advice to people when they have conversations with someone that's ideologically different in order to better engage like in kind of a debate structure?
Yeah, so I think one of the issues that progressives have is that ideas tend to ebb and flow in their prominence. What that tends to look like is, for example, when it came to women's right to vote, it was a very fringe idea. Even most women themselves didn't believe that it was particularly useful for them to be voting, and they didn't care very much about it. But then a small group of women decide to like slowly shift that norm, and then they come up with all of these arguments as to why women should vote. We have this conversation, we have the debate, we have tons of protests, people do property damage. There's all kinds of ways in which people do politics, like I say, in order to get their interests represented in politics. And this succeeds. And for a long time, that means that people who believed that women should be allowed to have the right to vote had a whole list of arguments that they had learned from prominent, compelling public figures at the time. And then, obviously, this norm becomes something that is now considered undebatable. Like, it would be a little bit strange if suddenly tomorrow at PMQs, the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer, was debating with Kemi Badenoch, the leader of the Conservative Party, as to whether or not women's right to vote should be rescinded. That would be considered very strange. And people probably would have no idea how that debate would even look, because they have now lost the ability to engage with a bad idea, because the idea is so bad and has become so fringe once again that we're no longer having the argument. So one of the tips that I always give people who I coach is, don't simply assume that people are on the same moralistic base, like have the same moralistic understanding of the world as you do. Now we're unfortunately having to debate ideas that we on the left had assumed were long dead, but in fact they're not. They're very alive and well. And the more that those ideas become mainstream, the more that the right gains a toolbox with which to dismantle these progressive values. And I think that we in turn need to look to the past and think about how these ideas were deconstructed through debating so that we can kind of deal with them head on. I mean, if I asked you right now, why is it the case that women should probably vote? Your first answer would probably be just, I mean, of course they should vote. Like, why wouldn't they vote? Because they're human beings. And if I responded to you with, well, okay, what about the fact that they're splitting up families? If a husband votes versus a wife voting, then what does that look like for the composition of the nuclear family? I think that's potentially a really bad thing. This is someone who has a constructed list of arguments that come from 100 years ago or whatever, coming against someone who believes just that obviously this is the moral thing. Even, if you're someone who's slowly entering through this pipeline, who are you going to find more compelling?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good point of just like, I think in general, even like debate aside, it's an important intellectual exercise to really evaluate why you believe in the things that you do, right? I think so many people, even people like myself that, have followed independent news or, read books, read too many books instead of sleeping or whatever the case may be on political issues or history or whatever, like you can find yourself sitting in a norm because it's, like you said, you view it as the moral norm, or that, like, of course everybody believes in this until they don't, right? Like, I think,
Exactly.
I think, abortion in the United States was probably the biggest wake up call for me with that, when, almost every single one of us on the liberal or left side or whatever the case, on the entire spectrum that isn't pro-life, viewed this as a done issue because it had been, basically put into stone from what we thought, like, for decades. And then until it's not, not that there wasn't debate on it, but it was basically a forlorn issue that it was, or a forlorn conclusion that it was going to continue to exist on a national scale. And I think and that was even an issue where, other than talking about morality, people were not effective in displaying to people that would maybe either be on the fence or contentious about the issue or have certain qualms about it, talking about like the pertinent, real economic, statistical, societal implications of having that removed. And we're seeing the repercussions of it now in various states in this country, right? So that's like a perfect example of, like, again, not that any of us talking about that would have necessarily saved Roe v. Wade in this country, but it would give people a more apt way to keep the Overton window where it should have been, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, all of that makes a lot of sense. That's something for me to think about with issues. So thanks for giving me some homework. So I get Tilly, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate your time. I guess, like, one last question before I let you go, I'll also just have you plug where people can find you. But as I think a lot of people, there's very few people that I think sort of have like an online reaction to the scale that you did pretty instantly from this debate. I wanted to ask this earlier, but what was that like for you in the aftermath of this? What was the reaction like? How surreal did it feel? Was it good? Was it bad? Did you kind of have to turn your phone off and walk away for a day or two? Like, what was kind of like the aftermath of that for you? And just got to speak to that a little bit to kind of end things off here.
Yeah, I mean, I went viral during my exam term. So in Cambridge,
Fantastic. Yeah.
yeah, in Cambridge, we have an entire term dedicated to revising for our exams and then doing them. And it was like the week before my first exam, the exam that I also found the most difficult. And that was when I started blowing up. And that was when I got messages from my younger sister, who's super into the debate culture stuff, who watches Twitch streamers, saying, "You need a Twitch, you need a YouTube, you need to do all this." And obviously I was just totally overwhelmed by it. I thought my prediction was I did all right. It was fine. I had a conversation. I kind of had the debate in my head before I went, and it went exactly how I thought it would go. This might get a couple 100,000 views. Isn't that great? Now I get to talk about foreign policy and American politics and UK domestic politics and culture and fascism and all of those things I'm interested in. Now I get to talk to 10,000 people rather than 5,000 people about that. Maybe even 20, 30,000 people. If people think that my debate was good. And so I expected it to do quite well. Like, that was the expectation. I didn't expect it to get, I think it has like over 20 million views, like maybe probably even more than that, like across so many different channels. And I just found it was so reinvigorating, because for me, it's at a time when I believe that the left is on the back foot and we have to be doing anything possible when it comes to our rhetoric, when it comes to the unity that we have to regain. I had lost a little bit of hope for the left, and I thought that we're a bit doomed. That was basically, a running joke that I have about my dissertation, is that the conclusion is we're doomed. And so to see millions of people, to have thousands of messages from young girls that I had inspired them and that I was giving them hope. I got messages from girls saying, I'm from Arkansas, I'm from Texas, and my family are pro-Trump, and they put your debate on the TV, and it caused them to call into question some of their belief systems. And to me, it meant a lot. I mean, it means I can do politics potentially even as a career, even from the age of 20 years old, which it makes me incredibly lucky and privileged to be able to do that. But more than that, it's those moments where I can open my phone and I can see, 5,000 message requests. I'm 14 years old. I saw your debate. I was inspired. I'm 13 years old. A boy said this to me on the bus, and I said this, and yeah. It means a lot. I cried a lot, to be honest with you, when I started going viral, just because of the messages I was receiving.
Well, that's great, because I often worry for people when it goes to that level. That I'm sure you also got your fair share of like awful comments or messages or whatever.
I'm unmarriageable, totally unmarriageable.
Yeah. I think
yeah.
I saw you had that maybe in like your profile header of one of your social media profiles or something that literally had some message for somebody. Yeah. But it's good to hear that there was like so much of that like hopeful response to it, because I do think that people are I mean, I could see, young young girls in a red state or anywhere at this point, you know, in younger spaces, feeling alienated right now, especially as like you see more and more right wing, more and more far right figures get bigger and bigger. New ones seem to pop out like weeds every other day with massive profiles. So it's good to hear that. That's very like heartening, I guess. As you know, I think I said this to you, but I'm a public education teacher in my day job, and so just hearing like teenagers say that to you is absolutely fantastic. Here, there's a little bit of hope there. So again, Tilly, thanks so much for doing this. I really hope people, if they haven't seen it, again, I'll put some clips throughout this when I edit this today. Definitely go check out these videos that I've referenced. That'll also be in the show notes below of everything Tilly's kind of done in public profile things with debates with, again, Charlie Kirk, or your talk about foreign policy and everything in between. Go ahead and plug what you've got going on next. I know you talked about that you're trying to do this debate with Pearl Davis. There's you know, I'm sure there's other people that you might try to engage with in the future. So kind of what's going on in the future with you, as well as where people can find you online.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying that stuff about Pearl earlier, I saw her replying to my messages on my laptop screen. I was like, yes. So yeah, I'll be having the debate with Pearl at some point. I hope that comes out as soon as it can. It's kind of reliant on how soon she wants that to be. I have some media appearances scheduled. So I was on Lad Bible is a huge channel in the UK, and I was on a debate kind of panel there, and that should be out soon. I have I've got a few things scheduled, and yeah, I mean, I can't give too much away because I get in trouble for saying things I don't. But yeah, people can find me at blondepraxis is my name on TikTok and YouTube, and yeah, I mean, that's mainly where I post at the moment. So
yeah, absolutely, and again, that'll all be in the notes below. And thanks so much for taking your time to do this with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.